Morning, good afternoon, good evening to depending upon where you are on this amazing planet of ours. Today, as I'm sure I don't need to say, is International Women's Day. We are marking International Women's Day as we do every year with a Human Rights Centre Speaker Series event dedicated to this particular theme and this particular issue. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for giving up your time to join us today. My name is Dr. Andrew Fagan. I'm Director of the Human Rights Centre. Our speaker who I'll introduce to you in a moment is Professor Kate Gilmore, who's very graciously given up her time to share with us for the next hour or so. So by ways of introduction, Kate Gilmore is Honorary Professor within the Human Rights Centre. She is the former UN Deputy Commissioner for Human Rights, Deputy Executive Director of UNFPA, and Deputy Secretary General of Amnesty International. Kate has entitled today's talk very interestingly. I did not have transnational sexual relations with the leader. We'll see what exactly that consists of in due course. By way of a short kind of blurb, as it were, on the content of Kate's talk. We have the following: political forces are breathing new life into old-fashioned opposition to sexual and reproductive health and rights, with more regressions in SRHR-related policy and law underway than are grabbed by news headlines. Scientific and normative breakthroughs for SRHR have seen fewer women and girls die when given life. More infants are surviving their first days to better thrive in their first years. However, realization of universal human rights in these most intimate domains is anything but equal and inclusive. And organized opposition to their advance is virulent and well-financed. Why? Is that simply to be expected or accepted? Are those dynamics local only, organic and homegrown, or are they manufactured somehow? And if so, if they are, by whom, to what end, and who benefits? Initial findings of Kate's ongoing research will be presented today into historical and contemporary flows of collaboration, investment, and promulgation that work to obstruct and erode the enjoyment of sexual and reproductive rights and dignity. Possible human rights implications for law, policy, and advocacy will also be indicated. Kate will speak for around about 35 to 40 minutes. There'll be an opportunity then for you to set questions in the Q&A facility. Please feel free to set questions at any particular time. I will do my utmost to ensure that I set as many of them as I possibly can, of course, to Kate. We have about 15-20 minutes then remaining for this particular session. Kate, enough of me. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew, and for the generous introduction, and my warmest greetings to everybody, and indeed happy International Women's Day. I'm going to talk about the issues Andrew has outlined, but I thought it, just in case listening to me proves far too tedious, that I would also share some slides to give a little more interest or provocation to the presentation. So let me see if I can get the screen share working right now. And given it is International Women's Day, I wanted to start with an incident at the 63rd session of the Commission on the Status of Women held in 2019. You know, that particular session of CSW was convened in New York to look at the interplay between social protection systems, public services, and gender inequality, and to advance propositions about what might be needed if the rights of women were to be upheld. Now, as the delegates met to discuss social protection, there was a not in service New York bus circulating in the precinct of the UN compound, and adorned on its side, as hopefully you can see, was a huge poster featuring a fetus, and clearly sponsored by an organization called Citizen Go. Now, Citizen Go is a Madrid-based organization and a renowned campaigner for Spain's far-right political party, Vox. The disruptive tactics that dogged the 63rd session of CSW were fronted by the US delegation to the Commission under the then Trump administration. And those tactics became so intense that the facilitator, the chief facilitator of CSW at the time, had to be given close personal protection, security guards, even when moving around the UN compound itself. My question is, what on earth does an anti-abortion poster on the side of a New York City bus have to do with Spain's parliamentary elections? What does a Madrid-based NGO have to do with the 45th president of the United States? Putting buses into service in that way is an expensive business. Who paid for that? Who crafted and funded that campaign of disruption? And it leads me to my research point was, have we been asking the right questions of anti-abortionism? Let's be clear that today there is far more recognition normatively, including by the UN human rights system, that access to safe and legal abortion is inextricably linked to enjoyment of human rights for women and girls. The evidence from a scientific standpoint is also clear. Banning abortion doesn't reduce it, it just makes it more dangerous, imperiling the lives and well-being of more than 700 million women and girls the world over, meaning each year 23,000 at least, and we don't know because of the censorship of associated data, but at least 23,000 lose their lives from preventable causes thanks to unsafe abortion. Abortion at the point where most of it is performed is in fact a straightforward and safe procedure to undertake, even in humanitarian settings. And remarkably, global surveys confirm that only 5% of us worldwide believe that there should be never any abortion allowed under any circumstances, only 5% of us. And while advances once thought possible have been won in the area of abortion legislation, from Argentina to New Zealand, Chile, to Benin, from Ireland to Nepal, and they're wonderful, amazing achievements, still there are severe restrictions in place, meaning that at least 41% of the world's population, and given the recent Roe v. Wade overturning in the US Supreme Court, a growing percentage, but at least 41% of the world's population is denied dignified access to safe abortion. 41% denied that which 95% of us support. Why? How come? The dynamics at play in 2019 CSW, they're no doubt underway in CSW, which is meeting even as we speak in New York this week. Those dynamics are evident in multilateral and national forums the world over and have infected a whole range of negotiations. They're often convened under the banner of a Vatican-invented term, gender ideology, meaning sexual and reproductive health and rights. And the tactics have drawn a lot of attention in a lot of countries, and they've borne some fruit. The decision by Turkey and Poland to pull out of the Istanbul Convention on Violence Against Women is but one example. Even trade and climate negotiations have been disrupted in the fight against so-called gender ideology. My question is why? And I wonder if we've in fact been asking the wrong questions historically about the nature of anti-abortionism. Have we somehow been suckered into a passive acceptance that promoted as if it were an article of faith that anti-abortionism is somehow God-given, an inevitability, inevitably supported by the faithful, and thus somehow largely unassailable by the rest of us. And that was, again, my point of inquiry. And I want to share with you via a case example what I think might be revealed if we just probe a little further. Let's go back to Citizen Go, who sponsored the bus circulating in the UN precinct in New York. Citizen Go is, by its own account, an online community promoting life, family, and liberty. But journalistic and other investigative inquiry have told us a different story. Open Democracy, for example, reports that Citizen Go was set up in 2013, the same year as Vox, political party, was established in Spain, and its purpose was to mimic other civil society platforms such as avaz.org and moveon.org. Remarkably, it's grown to be active by its own claim in Africa, in Europe, Latin America, Russia, and the US. The European Parliamentary Forum for Sexual and Reproductive Rights, under the leadership of a great guy called Neil Datta, has done some extraordinary groundbreaking work to understand financial flows to groups such as Citizen Go. And they established that, like many other anti-sexual and reproductive health and rights actors in Europe, Citizen Go is a funny mix of US Christian right, militant European Catholics, old European royal families, and Russian Orthodox hardliners, and even some sanctioned oligarchs. Its tactics are a mix of digital campaigns, political lobbying, and protests on the ground. And they've won some victories. The Bureau of Investigative Journalism and data science company Signify show through their research how Citizen Go helped block legislation in Kenya designed to extend access to legal abortion, and in Ghana, where some of the most draconian legislation is being debated this month by Parliament in Accra with the intention of imposing lengthy prison sentences, custodial sentences on LGBTQI+ persons. Likewise, the Mozilla Foundation, it's a foundation associated with the company behind the web browser Firefox, also established that Citizen Go manipulated Twitter conversations in Kenya and beyond on sexual and reproductive health and rights, using misinformation and inflammatory rhetoric, as well as cash and instruction, to make sure that certain topics and opinions trended in the course of that debate about pending legislation. And just to add salt to the wound, CNN has established that, in fact, some member states have even aided and abetted the partners of Citizen Go. For example, in Ghana, official development assistance has flowed to key evangelical and other Christian bodies who partnered for the purpose of campaigning against the extension of human rights to anyone who identifies as LGBTQI. Citizen Go, quickly with a remarkable impact. Now that's, the how and the what of it. The question, I think, is, well, who are they? And what is it that stands behind them? If you go onto their website, you can see that Citizen Go has a board of 7 people, a board of 8 people, 7 of whom are men. And on that board, there is a member of President Putin of Russia's inner circle. There is a man who is a former member of the Italian Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, currently imprisoned for taking bribes from Azerbaijani politicians to help mute criticism of Baku's human rights record. And there's a representative of the anti-vax climate change denying US-based Population Research Institute. And of course, a member of the Vatican in a circle. My question is, though, you might understand perhaps a Vatican representative sitting on such a body, but Putin's people, people who are actively involved in anti-vaccine popularism in the US and other such luminaries, why would they be sitting on the board of something like Citizen Go? And to make it more challenging, Citizens Go is just one of what the European Parliamentary Forum has identified as just one of 54 NGO foundations, religious organisations, political parties working across Europe, generating an enormous amount of funds, estimated between the period of 2009 and 2018 to be some 700 million, generating an enormous amount of money to contest and disrupt efforts to advance human rights, particularly for women, girls, and people who identify as other than the cis standard, if you like, for want of a better term, eluding me. So Citizen Go is part of this larger wealthy network. And again, why on earth would this be the case that so much money and so much interest and so much influence is being generated for the purpose of advancing an attack on fundamental human rights? The finding of the Parliamentary Forum on Europe is actually illuminated further by an open democracy investigation that, even in a much narrower span, identified 280 million totally of dark money going from the US far right, the Christian far right, across the world. And in turn, the Southern Poverty Law Centre established that network of which Citizen Go is part is in fact a larger herd of influencers seeking to reach out into a wide range of countries across the world under the banner of something called the World Congress of Families. And the Southern Poverty Law Centre listed them, World Congress of Families, of course, on their hate watch. And they noted in particular the European Centre for Law and Justice, the Alliance Defending Freedom, the Centre for Family and Human Rights, known as CFAM, and a group called Agenda Europe. But when investigative journalist Julia Daskta, who's actually also a researcher with Reporters Foundation, took a look at what the World Congress of Family represented, she made an important finding. And it was this. She said, the impression we get when we look at the funds and the organizations and the reach of these extreme far-right Christian groups, they leave an impression that they're somehow a broad and diverse international front. But in reality, they're often the same people or simply different entities, sometimes new entities wrapped around existing organizations and networks. Seriously, all of that put together to combat LGBTI rights, to combat contraception, to combat safe abortion, to combat comprehensive sexuality education. Why on earth would that be? Are we to believe it's singularly only theological conviction? I think if you go further into what sits behind this elaborate appearance of network, there is a very troubling story to be revealed. Let me go back to the board of Citizen Go and to a character called Brian Brown. Brian Brown, incidentally, who sits on Citizen Go's board, is president of the US-based National Organization for Marriage. He's president of the International Organization for the Family and founder of this World Congress of Families, which notably has hosted such luminaries as Prime Minister Viktor Orban, Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban, and Italy's Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini, who incidentally said, well, the World Congress of Families, as convened in this heteronormative, homophobic and misogynist way, is exactly representing the sort of Europe we would like to see. It was Brian Brown, head of this World Congress of Families, its key founder, who organised a family values conference in Ghana, where local efforts were whipped up to support the legislation that I referred to earlier. What's interesting about Brian Brown, and you see him here standing on the far right, metaphorically and literally, of a meeting where he's with, as he notes, Justices Alito and Kavanaugh of the US Supreme Court. What's interesting about Brown, amongst other things, is that he's a long-term collaborator of a US-based group called Citizens United, and a long-term collaborator of its president, who was deputy manager of Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign. The president of Citizens United is a bloke called David Bossie. And in fact, it was David Bossie, Brian Brown's mate, who first introduced Steve Bannon to Donald Trump. The mission of Citizens United under Bossie is strong national defence, constitutionally limited government, free market economics, belief in God and Judeo-Christian values, and recognition of the family as a single social unit of our society. It's worked with such right-wing media luminaries as the former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, Michelle Bachmann, famous for her denial of the 2021 presidential election results, and with arch anti-abortionist Mike Huckabee, father of one of Trump's spokespersons and now current governor of Arkansas, Sarah Huckabee. But you know, Boss's greater claim to fame comes thanks to a Supreme Court ruling called Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission. You may be well aware that until that famous case, contributions made directly to US political candidates and their amount were meant to be both limited and disclosed. But the Citizens United ruling changed all that, opening the floodgates for dark money, for money to flow unwatched and unchecked from the private sector to political campaigns and political candidates. Indeed, in the single decade following the 2010 Citizens United case, election spending in the US ballooned to $4.5 billion, up from a total of only $740 million for 2 decades prior to the court's ruling. The Brennan Center for Justice, writing in 2015 about Citizens United impact, says this: in a time of historic wealth inequality, the Citizens United decision of the Supreme Court made it possible for nearly 60% of all funds to flow unchecked to political parties from just 195 individuals and their spouses. 195 individuals only. Nearly all of them white, male, multi-millionaires, and thus profoundly unrepresentative of the US broader electorate. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote of the Citizens United decision that it was the worst ruling of the current court. But it was a decision warmly welcomed by the US Chamber of Commerce, which the Brennan Center for Justice ranked as being at the very top of the new league of dark money spenders under Citizens United. Citizens United also increased the risks of interference from foreign entities and foreign money from foreign corporations. Also, President Obama at the time warned immediately afterwards in his 2010 State of the Union address. Fears later to be vindicated given the indictments of Ukraine associates of Trump's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani. Excuse me, I'm mispronouncing. But to go back to Citizen Go's Brian Brown, it's just interesting to note that it was Brian Brown's lawyer who acted for Citizen United in that case. Brian Brown's lawyer being one James Bopp, a long-term legal counsel to the National Right to Life Committee. Bopp would go on to also join the Trump re-election campaign at the invitation of Trump's legal advisor, Jay Sekulow, who's president of both the anti-abortionist American Center for Law and Justice and the European Center for Law and Justice, which we met just earlier in the findings of the European Political Forum for Sexual and Reproductive Rights. Incidentally, Jay Sekulow is campaigning currently against the alleged NGO bias of the judges of the European Court of Human Rights, and he's campaigning against funding for special procedures of the UN human rights system. But Bopp has also acted in legal suits against vaccine mandates in the context of COVID-19 and in disputes before the courts of outcomes of the 2020 US presidential election. Both Sekulow and Bopp, pictured here by the Daily Mail of all sources, for their November meeting in 2020 with Lindsey Graham and Larry Ellison, the billionaire founder of Oracle, and with Fox commentator Sean Hannity, have played a major role in the efforts to contest Biden's win. A small handful of fabulously wealthy, fabulously connected white men at the center of a worldwide push against sexual and reproductive health and rights. Why would this be? I think it's useful to consider, towards an answer to that question, the legal precursors to Citizen United that helped pave the way for this exceptional and highly biased, utterly disproportionate political influence of a small handful of fabulously wealthy white men. For brevity, let's just take a look at a main example from back in the 70s called Buckley versus Valeo, a Supreme Court ruling that was extended in the first National Bank of Boston versus Bellotti decision of 1978, which are key precursors to the 2010 Citizen United decision. The Supreme Court's decision in those early cases ruling long-standing limits on spending of political campaigns rather than donating, which is what Citizen United addressed. And importantly, did so using the concept that spending money on behalf of a political candidate or party is an exercise of freedom of speech. And they then went on to find that corporations, whether for profit or not for profit, have a right to freedom of speech akin to that of persons. It's a very seminal moment for jurisprudence in that it starts to detach personhood from the individual and attaches personhood inclusively to corporations and to constructs, key constructs of personhood, and with very significant consequences. But again, perhaps as in Citizen United, the petitioner story behind Buckley v. Valeo is telling. This time, in Buckley v. Valeo. A co-petitioner was Senator Joseph McCarthy, of the famous for his interrogation and persecution of those alleged to have communist ties in the 50s, 50s and 60s. So Joe McCarthy was a co-petitioner, but the lead petitioner in Buckley v. Valeo was none other than James Buckley. It's James Buckley, the very same one who'd been head of the US delegation to the 1984 Mexico City UN Population and Development Conference, where Buckley is the one who introduced the so-called Mexico City policy, or the global gag rule that successive Republican administrations have introduced to prohibit any and all official development assistance going to an organization that even mentions the term abortion. And the global gag rule famously was most extensively expressed under the Trump administration. What's useful to know about James Buckley is not only his direct connection to extreme anti-abortionism, but that he was the older brother of a guy called William Buckley, who's the founder of the right-wing and still persistent magazine, The National Review, and who's having something of a renewal of his existence currently because he's infamous for a debate with James Baldwin in the 60s. With Buckley, it was held in Cambridge, and it's currently the subject of a renewal of interest both in a film and in a theatre production, because the debate is so revealing about how central racism was and opposition to the civil rights movement being at the very core of the ideologies of the Buckley brothers and their like. This William Buckley that you see here, his racism was so deep and so persistent that you can track it over time. And it clearly began to take on political agitation around the time of the Supreme Court ruling on Brown v. the Board of Education, that said, of course, famously, that racial segregation in public education is unconstitutional. Buckley would write about abortion that it was the consequence of irresponsible women, but fumed that it was Black women who were irresponsible on a massive scale. As his racism had to become more covert throughout as the 70s unfolded, he morphed his advocacy into a campaign that's still running on in the right of the US, into a campaign for homeschooling and against public education, meaning for racially segregated education as opposed to public education. And he campaigned actively for defunding of public schools. And it's exactly the policy that was championed by Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education under Trump more than 50 years later. And it's a policy call, incidentally, strongly advocated in Russia by Putin's man on the Citizen Go board. The 1960s and the 1970s in the US, when the James Buckley, pardon me for my coughing, Supreme Court case was brought, was a period of considerable agitation by civil rights and social protest movements against racism, for women's rights, and against the Vietnam War. Many conservatives saw that unrest as a threat to America's underlying economic model, and to corporate America in particular. And Ralph Nader, who was at the forefront of developing the consumer rights movement, was a case in point. A New York Times article described Nader's hatred for corporate America and was quoted as cause for a confidential memo to the US Chamber of Commerce, penned by then corporate lawyer Lewis Powell. Lewis Powell said the very survival of the free enterprise system was at stake. And he said the threat wasn't communism or the new left, but the threat was intellectuals, journalists, and scientists. Imagine that. And he urged the Chamber of Commerce to take on a campaign, take over the universities, take over the media, take up strategic litigation, sponsor political action, and mobilise public support. It's a chilling memo, of course, but all the more so because he wrote as a member of the board of global tobacco giant Philip Morris, which at the time was actively campaigning against the science of the dangers of smoking and for its positive benefits. And in the same year as he wrote that memo, Powell ran a case before the US Court of Appeals in which he argued that corporations had a First Amendment right to spread corporate lies in response to whatever the corporates said, whatever the corporation cared to say was true about smoking and health. He was at the forerunner of a dishonest marketing of corporate interests. But it's all the more chilling still because in the same year that he wrote the memo and argued that case, he was appointed to the Supreme Court. Now, there's a big debate as to whether Powell's advice to the US Chamber of Commerce made any difference. But what's irrefutable is in the years following his advice, the Chamber of Commerce got active. Its membership quadrupled. 95% of CEOs reported spending far more time on external relations after the Powell memo, and the presence of corporations in Washington multiplied by 500%. And by the end of the 1970s, there were 12,000 lawyers acting for corporations in Washington, whilst the US Chamber of Commerce had opened up its own litigation centre. But there was one thing missing that the Chamber of Commerce could not figure out a method for, and that was Powell's appeal to get popular mobilisation for their campaign to protect free enterprise. And popular support in the lead up to the 1980 president's election would just be essential, not the least because there had been set aside precious tax gains for the very, very rich, the overwhelming white male American sector that had to be protected thanks to the 1978 Revenue Act, as scholar Julia Ott lays out in Nobel laureate Stiglitz's latest edited collection, The Great Polarization, How Ideas, Power and Politics Drive Inequality. But for all their efforts and infrastructure, they could not crack the popular mobilization. That's referring to the tax policy. What came in their place was something called the New Right. And it's here that the birth of attack politics emerges clearly in the US context. But it's important to notice that these same people, notably Arthur Finkelstein, went on to advise over the coming decades key luminaries of attack politics, divisive populism such as Benjamin Netanyahu, who found the advice so helpful that he recommended him to Viktor Orban. Charles Stone and Paul Manafort, very famous in Trump's team and in all sorts of trouble around the January 6th Capitol Hill insurrection, were active as part of this cohort of the New Right, trying to generate, through attack politics, the popular mobilization for a very conservative economic agenda that otherwise they were not winning. They weren't the only ones to think that popular mobilization for free enterprise and for the neoliberal economic agenda was essential. So too did these magnates, the Koch brothers, who are extremely influential today and in fact helped fund the Tea Party that took on Obamacare around the time in which Citizen Go was formed. But their Libertarian Party, they said, could be the mass mobilization arm of what Powell had called for to protect corporations' interests and the interests of the super wealthy. But their Libertarian Party, which actually started out pro-abortion and later, as it disappeared, didn't stick with being pro-abortion, the Libertarian Party won only 1% of the vote in their single appeal for presidential claim in 1980. So they were, the far right was, well, the new right, I beg your pardon, was in some trouble in the lead up to the presidential campaign. But there was one person amongst their ranks that was showing how to awaken an otherwise sleeping part of the electorate, and that was Phyllis Schlafly. Only Phyllis Schlafly was mobilising into political action those who otherwise figured nowhere in the ranks of party activists across the United States. As scholar Amelia Riberas has observed, Phyllis Schlafly's ultimately and surprisingly successful campaign against the Equal Rights Amendment had a singular strategy, and that in the main was to link the ERA to abortion and to link abortion to the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, she herself was an observant Catholic, and of course, although not opposed historically to abortion, the Catholic Church certainly was opposed to abortion in the 1970s. But in the 70s, although 91% of the US population identified as Christian, only 26% were Catholic, and the other Christians from the major Protestant denominations were not opposed to abortion. In fact, right up until the 1980 presidential election, the Southern Baptist Convention passed resolutions calling for greater access to legal abortion. And it wasn't until 1979, some 6 years after Roe v. Wade, that anti-abortionism became a political force. And it was as the presidential election loomed, and with Schlafly's example in mind, that the new right invited Southern Baptist preacher and radio star Jerry Falwell, who was vehemently opposed to racial integration and afraid that his segregated academy, the Liberty University, would lose tax-exempt status. They invited Falwell to meet with them to talk about how to mobilise, awaken a new electorate amongst Protestants in support of Ronald Reagan. And from there, the moral majority was born. A vehement anti-abortionist campaign of support for the election of Ronald Reagan, who, in a deal with the New Right founders, changed his tune on abortion because he had introduced the most progressive abortion legislation when governor of California. It's worth noting that this initiative of the moral majority was enthusiastically greeted by the fathers of Ted Cruz and Sarah Huckabee, and it grew to be, as described by a former aide to James Buckley, who we met before when writing in 1980, as an institutionalised, disciplined, well-organised, well-financed movement that capitalises on the passions behind single issues causes, feeding on discontent, anger, insecurity, resentment, flourishing on backlash politics, and through its interlocking network, it seeks to veto whatever it perceives to threaten its way of life. And threaten its way of life. Anti-busing of children to desegregate schools, anti-women's liberation, anti-gay rights, anti-pornography, anti-loss of the Panama Canal, and pro a beefed up defence budget, lower taxes, and reduced federal regulation of business. 40 years later, when writing herself about these same phenomena, the author Catherine Stewart says effectively the same thing as was written in 1980. There's a tendency on the part of those outside of this system of influence to view the religious right movement as somehow a pre-modern phenomenon clinging to ancient doctrines. but it's a modern movement in every respect. Modern in methods, modern in marketing, and modern in doctrine. You know, today's goals of the backers of Citizen Go are cast less crudely, perhaps, than the demands of the moral majority. But the tactics and the ambition are the same. With the power of abortion as a dog whistle and rallying flag, working still Trojan horse-like to protect and advance right-wing corporate protectionist policy and interests, and thus the interests of a super elite of stunningly wealthy white men. The Great Moderation, or the neoliberal era, ushered in under such as Reagan economics and sustained by continued corporate and wealthy campaigning of the kind templated by the New Right in the late 1970s and early 1980s, would, as Nobel laureate economist Stiglitz says, lead directly to today's great polarization. The great moderation to the great polarization. Evident in skyrocketing inequality, a capture by those at the top of the most growth in aggregate income, and a precipitous erosion of democratic norms and governance. What does it mean? Well, it's the same white, wealthy, and worried men that the Brennan Centre pointed to, 22 of which Oxfam reminds us own more wealth than all of the women of Africa combined. What happened in the intervening period between Reagan and today is a story for another time. We could look at the Koch brothers and their extraordinary funding of anti-choice organisations over the period of decades. We could go on and talk about the founder of Domino's Pizza and his incredible infrastructure for selling anti-abortionism as the Trojan horse for extreme right deregulation of markets, deregulation of labour, and deregulation of the environment. We could put a cold beer with the pizza and look at the story of Joseph Coors and the Coors family, who likewise have funded an extraordinary infrastructure, including Jay Sekulow, who we talked about before. They were the ones who gave Roger Ailes his break, and Roger Ailes, of course, became head of Fox News. What is important to understand if we were looking at those case studies is that they are transnational and they're global in their impact. There are any numbers of these fabulously wealthy elites who are behind so much of what we see manifest in polarization of politics today. And my point is simply this: we have to get better at asking better questions. And here, to return to the theme of today, International Women's Day, I pay tribute to scholar Cynthia Enlow, who said, whatever you do, ask better questions, ask curious feminist questions. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Great, thank you for such a detailed, such a fascinating, such a disturbing, worrying in many ways presentation. I was picturing, you know, those scenes that you see in TV or film crime or police dramas where there's an evidence board. There's always a board in an office room somewhere, and there are the suspects and the links between them. I was picturing your presentation in those terms. Actually, you sort of lay out who the principal suspects are and the very worrying connections between them. So thank you. Thank you so much. Obviously, I was inviting questions from our audience. Please, if you can place them in the Q&A, that would be really helpful. We only have about 5 minutes or so for questions, but I have a really concrete question, Kate. Not particularly interesting one, but one that sort of stood out, which is that the money being donated in the EU seems to be huge by comparison with the US. It looked to me, maybe I just misread the figures, but 4 times as much funding from within the EU as opposed to the US. Is that correct? And if so,
well,
how does that work?
I mean, it's absolutely correct in terms of what's been found, but it's why in my garbled presentation, my apologies for coughing partway through, but it's why I was pointing to the series of Supreme Court rulings that darkened money and allowed money donation and the donors to not be tracked. The difference in Europe is it's much more transparent. And that's interestingly for me from all the research that's gone into that, you know, that there is a normative challenge here about how do we uphold, you know, the basic principles of, you know, the Paris Declaration on International Aid set out about transparency and accountability for transnational flows. But the agenda within the US, aided by the Supreme Court, has been to darken and block and obfuscate both who gives the money and what money is given in which amounts, which is why trying to map it also beyond the US becomes so important, I think. And an interesting challenge for human rights, because it then connects to, you know, how do you load that up against the Soros Foundation or Bill and Melinda Gates? Now, we, of course, would say, well, first of all, they do report transparently. Secondly, in the main, they're working for realization of human rights norms. Well, these guys are clearly working against realization of human rights norms and not working to rule. So there are important differences. But isn't it interesting that we haven't actually articulated those principles clearly, and they don't immediately come to mind and we can't point to them authoritatively?
Absolutely. No, absolutely right. So questions appearing in the Q&A. Here's one. The far right in the US has been successful due to extreme organization and funding. Why do you think that this large majority cannot get together to fight this vocal minority? And how can we change? How can we change that? That's a fascinating question, Kate. It's a huge one.
Beautiful.
It could take a week to answer.
It's at the heart, and you know, whoever asked that, you're literally on the money, but without the money. And this is the thing I think we on the, you know, to identify myself as being on the left, if I may, but you know, we on the progressive left have utterly underestimated the toxicity of the concentrations of wealth. And we're way behind the game in that we haven't really noticed how escalated are those concentrations of wealth, or at least deepened in the last 2 decades. We haven't noticed, I think, sufficiently or problematized that a product of neoliberalism now is a hyper monopoly of disposable income. And that's what Joe Stiglitz has begun to write about, and saying it's that hyper monopoly of global surplus income that is now at the root of the destabilization of the multilateral system, of democratic institutions, and all the institutions that uphold democracy and of core values. I think it's a fascinating revelation, and it reminds us that sometimes our discipline areas have to come together for us to really understand what's going on. We need economics at the table of human rights, economists at the table of human rights discussants to fully appreciate why this wealth is just so toxic. They have a disproportionate ability to drown us all out. The rest of us have in fact lost net value of income over these last 2 decades and are struggling to make even basic means, to meet even basic means and the means to meet basic needs, and have not even, let alone surplus value, don't have surplus time to do the sort of organising that we know is needed to push back against this plutocracy. And that is the big challenge for us, I think, going forward.
You concluded your talk, Kate, with a kind of rallying cry or an appeal for us to ask more effective questions or curious questions, as you refer to them. What would they be? Why are do the existing frameworks, conceptual, theoretical frameworks within the human rights sort of paradigm, are they not fit for purpose? Are we asking Are we asking the wrong questions by just omission, or do we need to rethink the way that we think about human rights, particularly in these areas?
What led me to that suggestion that we need to ask better questions was really, comes from my own field of interest, which is sexual and reproductive health and rights, and realizing how passive scholarship had been on abortion, and how even very bright, deep thinkers about gender theory and gender identity had a sense of fatalism, that it was inevitable, thanks to religion, that there'd always be people against abortion. And it made no sense to me that that should be our approach when the global values surveys kept telling us that 95% of the population is in favour of abortion globally, and yet we see these regressions. So I immediately thought, but why? We've got, why be passive in something that's killing people and accept it somehow as a religious inevitability? What if it's not? And that was just one example of why I think asking better questions and going why 3 or 4 times into a phenomena can be highly revealing. I actually think the human rights framework gives good tools for that. And the good tools are, who benefits from a horrendous situation? Ask that question. How do they benefit, and how do they organise to ensure they continue to benefit? That's the accountability question. And then whose responsibility is it to intervene in unjust, unfair and inhumane benefit? We just need to bravely probe and ask those questions, including where that challenges the rule of law, when it starts, or I should say rule by law, that starts to deviate from adherence to human rights norms.
We've got a final question for the final minute of our talk, and it's as follows. You've highlighted the importance of asking better questions. What do you see as the next step? What do we do when we have the answers?
I think it's fantastic to contemplate that. I think there's a whole interesting field of inquiry for human rights here, and human rights as applied. What should we be doing normatively on corporations and undue influence? What are the norms that we should be applying and thinking about in transnational financial flows of this kind? What does it mean for the future of development assistance and aid? What does it mean when you've got these fabulously wealthy philanthropists, Bill and Melinda Gates on the one hand, and the Koch brothers on the other hand? By what norms do we determine and assess both their intent and the consequence of their actions, and where do we hold them to account? So I think there's a huge normative implication. For example, what is civil society of a kind that can be said to be consistent with realizing human rights norms? What scares me is that many of these actors, going back to Citizens Go and the World Congress of Families and all that fall under their banner, they have recognition by ECOSOC at the UN, and they're given a legitimacy of influence at the UN. And when Trump was in power, direct access to the Secretary General of the United Nations. Where's a normative framework to really challenge the legitimation, the cosmetics that are granted to them, given how, frankly, anti-human rights is their agenda, recalling its racism, its misogyny, its homophobia, designed actually to shore up a constituency for these extreme concentrations of wealth. They're the things that I think as human rights actors we've really got to push ourselves forward into thinking more creatively about.
And there we'll have to leave it, I'm afraid. We're out of time. Kate, thank you so much for such a fascinating talk on this particular day.
Thank you for this opportunity.